Welcome to the Pantheon Plus Rewind.
Thank you for joining us for part 2 of our interview with Kevin Jordan. Now, we wrapped up with talking about meta and itemization, and as we kind of threw the tease in there and ended the show for part 1, Theric started to begin to talk about our next topic, which is player behavior and just the evolution of the genre. So let's pick right back up there, and if you haven't caught part 1 of the episode, make sure to check it out on YouTube, iTunes, or Spotify. Again, thanks for joining us for this episode. Here we go.
And that sort of leads into the next topic that I want to ask you about. So we'll talk about player behavior and just sort of evolution of the genre as a whole. My question is a little bit related to the meta, but it's more about, general player behavior. We may have actually answered this already, but like we've seen design with MMO evolve to the point where we're thinking about like every task you want to accomplish, whether it's finding a group or finding a raid or just even communication or even travel, anything like that has become so easy and become so efficient.
Right.
I don't know. Sometimes I feel like that, and I've watched other videos, sort of commentary on this about that being to the detriment of the genre. You talked about the social impact of that a little earlier.
Yeah.
Is that the primary impact do you think it's had, or has there been other impacts that sort of efficient design has had?
I think there's impacts kind of across the board. I was talking earlier about relationships. A lot of MMO design is about the relationships between things. One of the key relationships is how much you value a thing is how hard it was to acquire, right?
Yeah.
The scarcity of a thing determines its value, right? These are relationships. So if it takes you 2 seconds to accomplish something, how much do you care about that thing versus if it takes you 2 months, you know?
Yeah.
Those are just relationships. And quite a few people are very confused about the value of the things that they're offering in terms of accomplishment with how long it takes to acquire them. They think that people just want to have them and they'll be somehow attached to the game or continue to play the game if we just hand stuff out every 2 seconds for little to no work, right? Which, you know, if you can train a dog to behave that way, right? And I suppose you can train a human, right? Let's just say some of us could be trained that way. But I think most people feel far more accomplished when it's actually something that took a little bit of work, a little bit of skill. The more skill, the more time, then the greater the accomplishment. And also the fewer people that have done it is another big one for a lot of people. You know, Naxxramas was done by something like 2% of the populace back in the day. And there are a variety of reasons, not just because it was difficult, but, and so a lot of people are excited to go back and do it because they were never able to do it before and they're prepped to do it now. But the people that were in that 2%, that was an elite group, right? That was a group that really valued, you know, that accomplishment. And that's because not very many people had done it. It was hard. You had to put some time in. And so, yeah, I think there's absolutely a relationship, and streamlining everything is always something players are going to ask for. I don't want to work that hard to get my pay, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But they're going to appreciate it a lot less. They're going to discard it a lot quicker. They're going to be demanding the next thing that they can't quite achieve because it's a little too much work. And so it's an endless cycle for the, relationship between the devs and the players, and the devs have to be resilient to it. They have to make people earn things at some point. So
it sort of becomes this race to the bottom, right?
Right. Everybody's done it, right? It's just like if everyone had done Nax because it was easy, no one would care about it this time around, but
it kind of comes back to that shining moment you talked about.
Yeah. It's funny. It's because I'm playing Guild Wars 2 right now. I played it a while ago, back in a few years back, and then I stepped away for a long time. I've just started playing it again now, and it's one of these games that just showers you with accomplishments constantly. And it's like, you get this and you get this achievement and you get this little, there's 6 chests waiting for me every time I log into the game. And
right.
I'm a human being with a monkey brain, and I can't help it. I do enjoy that in some aspect,
Yeah,
but I
for
don't
sure.
feel good about it either. I walk away
Yeah.
feeling like I just went through a fast food drive-through, and I'm like, it tasted great, but now I feel terrible. It doesn't have any lasting impact on me.
I'll relate it to a personal story. I went backpacking in the backwoods of Yosemite one year with some friends, and there was a lot of snow. We weren't ready for snow. And it was a really tough hike, and we were out in the middle of nowhere trying to find dry ground to basically camp on. And it challenged us significantly. We did some dangerous things, and at the end of the hike, we finally found dry, ground to camp on. And it was somebody's turn to do dinner, and they pulled out top ramen, right? A little pack of top ramen. I swear to God, it was the best meal I've ever had.
Yeah, absolutely. Right.
Like you could not put that in front of me today next to a really good bowl of ramen, right? And be like, yeah, no. But again, the fact that we made it through that day with everyone intact, made that meal absolutely amazing, right? So
that's awesome.
There's just relationships between these things, Yeah.
It's funny you say that, because I think, like, even thinking back to gaming, some of the most miserable, excruciating things that you overcame, you look back at that misery fondly. You don't when you're doing it.
Right.
Like for me, our guild almost fell apart fighting Heroic Coven. It was that was a hell of a fight.
Right.
And when we beat it, like, we had lost members, we'd kicked people out who were being toxic, we got new people. And when we beat it, it literally, like, I remember throwing my headset and just letting out a roar, right? Like, thank God.
Right. Yeah.
And
do you remember what items you got from that?
Nope. I don't remember the items. I remember,
usually you remember, because they're not just items. They're not just a few items.
I think it was the shoulders, if I'm not mistaken. The shoulders.
They're like trophies for that memory, I think
me,
that's why a lot of people remember the items from Classic much more than they do from retail now. It's because they're just that thing. They're that trophy they've been handed after a really excruciating, like you're saying.
But it's funny, like, leading up to that kill, it was the most frustrating, painful fight. When we got to it, I'm like, great. It was becoming, disastrous. And now I look back, and it's one of the greatest moments I've ever had in WoW, right? So it's kind of,
you went from the lowest morale point to the highest, right?
Yep.
And to me, that's the ultimate PvE experience, right? You go in, you fight a boss. It seems impossible. You just have no idea how you're going to beat this thing. And then you roll up your sleeves, you get to work. You start strategizing, you're talking with the guild, you're getting everyone optimized, and you go and after 5 runs, 10 runs, whatever it takes, you get it done. And then you're just like, we just did the impossible. Remember when we walked in here? We could not even imagine how we were going to beat this thing. And then we just did the impossible, right? That's the complete PvE experience.
Awesome. So going to the next question in this topic, what drove me into looking at Pantheon was bringing back group play. And you've kind of talked about this a little bit already. That was one of the biggest things they said, is like, bring friends. That was the original like video they put out there to try to like lure in donations and stuff. It was bring friends, because you got a group on almost everything. You needed a group of 4 or 5 people to take down a single orc. Like, it was that hard again. So you've said in your video, just to quote you here, that, communities, you said you have to force them. There has to be a real hardship for solo players. But at the same time, you've also said that anything that places trust in the community to behave is also a gamble, right?
It is, yeah.
With those two thoughts in mind, and the fact that we've said before, this isn't 1999 anymore. People are much different than they were back then. How do you force community, and what kind of guards do you think you have to have in place for that?
So yeah, there's different kinds of design. Hardship is definitely one of them, but just another one is, the aspirations, right? If the best stuff in the game is achieved and gained through group play, then that's a really strong incentive. So that was kind of one of the big ways that WoW differentiated itself from EQ, was we were okay with you soloing 1 to 60, right? But that didn't mean you got access to the best stuff in the game. You couldn't solo dungeons for the most part. You couldn't do raids by yourself. You couldn't get the best stuff and have the biggest adventures, right? And also just from a social standpoint, you couldn't have the most fun for anyone who's ever been in really, really good group experiences with cool people, right? So that's sort of this just like this background encouragement. Like, yeah, you're doing fine solo, but every once in a while you're going to bump into this thing you can't quite do. And then you're going to be like, maybe I'll group. And sure enough, there's another guy right over the next hill who's thinking the same thing because he's stuck in the same quest you are, right? Before you know it, you're in a duo, you knock down the thing because the power between one players and two players is more than double, right? And you guys feel great and you're like, yeah, let's quest for the next, couple hours. Now we're on a friends list, then we form a group more often, then a third person joins us before we know it, we're doing dungeons, and then that dungeon's growing into a guild and you're off to the races, right? But all of that is just from that subtle reminder every once in a while of you can't do some of the content without more people. And I think that's really important, especially for a game that lives and dies by its community and by its social interactions, both good and bad. And it also keeps the game fresh because you just never know what you're going to get with people. The content pretty much stays the same, but people are always different. It doesn't matter if you're PvPing them or not, just interacting with others socially. You never quite know what you're going to get with Baron's chat. Right?
It's so funny you said that. I was just about to say you could have never planned for Baron's chat to be what it was.
I mean, you mostly know you're going to get a Chuck Norris joke in there somewhere, but you don't know which Chuck Norris joke, right? So,
that's fantastic.
And so people are just always different. And that's what keeps people coming back is interacting with players. Right. And so in later MMOs where you're not encouraged or don't find yourself interacting with players, you get sort of in this mindset of just knocking out the levels and it's draining over time. You feel like you're on the treadmill. You feel like, what's the end result of this? Right. But a few good social experiences mixed in, and it revitalizes you, right? And they can be bad too. Like if you're going to kill a guy on one of your quests and someone kills it for you instead, or they steal one of your mineral nodes or whatever it is, that can get your blood flowing too, right? Gets you a little pissed off, right?
Exactly.
Now you find yourself competing with somebody for mineral nodes in the zone or whatever it is, and that can make that experience just for that next hour or so very different and keep you coming back for more. So
that's so interesting that you say that, because that's one of the things we hear all the time is people have become afraid of that kind of interaction. They say, well, I don't want somebody stealing my mob. I don't want, we talk about raid bosses. I don't want somebody stealing my raid boss. And we have this deep seated fear all of a sudden of interacting with other people in good and bad ways. And I think that's so interesting. One of the things you said in your video, I think about this is, and I hadn't ever thought of it this way before, was you said, there are people out there that want to sort of thwart the efforts to try to form communities because it's a threat to their viability as solo players. I thought that's so interesting because I'd never really realized that, but I think you're 100% right.
And that's, by the way, that's your role as a player. Your role is to be annoyed by those things and those moments, right?
Exactly.
And if you're hired as a player, right, this is where a lot of game companies get in trouble. They hire the players and the players go and they remove all those things they hate. And they think instantly, oh, better game, right? And it's like, well, actually, no, that's a trap. A good game designer knows that a bad experience is meaningful. A bad experience is kind of good for you, right? Sometimes you just have to take your medicine, right? And it gets you engaged. It gets your, like I said, your blood pumping. And as long as they're not all bad experiences, you have to deliver the good ones too. But that's the human condition, right? Yeah, and that's what gets us excited about things, gets us invested. It's really important. So a difference between a good game designer and someone who's just playing the game is very different. And so I don't blame people for being mad at, poor moments in a game or upsetting moments. But as a game designer, they're very important.
Yeah. You know what's funny about that? Like talking about the bad moments and maybe why people hold on to EQ so much, or like the older games, is because let's be honest, when they were first built, nobody knew what they were doing. There were a lot of things about those old games that were either because of limitations with design or not knowing how to do something that created these obstacles. Oh, for accidentally, right?
Yeah, Ultima Online is notorious for this. Like, it's more emergent gameplay than design, to be honest.
Yeah.
The things people did with that game and in that world probably came as a complete shock to the game designers. They probably just looked on in horror at the things. But it's one of the greatest games to ever come out, and I'm just like in awe of the experiences. And it's because of the emergent, not despite the emergent gameplay. So,
and it's hard to think we'll see that ever again, you know, or to that level.
Definitely, but it should be in every game designer's mindset in terms of like just respecting the value of experiences, good and bad. Because I mean, and even just like this goes down to the very core mechanic. I didn't win, right? I didn't win is a bad experience. You know, I died, I failed, whatever. That's a terrible experience, but that doesn't mean you remove it, right?
The participation trophy culture, right? Like that ties right into that.
Always win, you know, like that's not an experience. You're just being spoon fed, right? So, from the very simplistic idea of just sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, game designers should realize there's a texture in there that is really important.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Pantheon uses the hashtag community matters a lot. That's sort of the call sign in the Pantheon community. And I think that means, it's two simple words, but it means a lot to people. And that's why people gravitate towards this game that's in development.
Yeah. And also there's so the other important thing about like an EQ style development is when things are a little bit harder to achieve and you're not given, like you're saying, participation trophies, the higher that bar is, the fewer people are going to play the game as a consequence. But the people that do end up playing are usually people that can handle a little bit of adversity, right? And they tend to be more mature in some respects, and they'll be more like, again, socially reasonable, right? They'll be willing to communicate and collaborate. I noticed this in a game called Escape from Tarkov. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it's a very difficult game, and it takes from you more often than it gives to you. And the community is very nice. Like, there's something about the shared misery, right?
I was just shared misery
brings people together, right? And so the people that have made it through those early stages and haven't quit in disgust and thrown their, mouse and keyboard and quit forever, right? The people still remaining tend to be a little bit more mature, can handle adversity, and are willing to, cooperate and work together to accomplish goals. So the community can be much better in an environment like that. So it might be smaller, right? But it'll hopefully be better.
Yeah. The interesting part of, I'm sorry, get there.
No, go ahead. I was just going to say
that just real quick. The interesting thing about that too is if it's smaller from the developer side or the company running the game, it's probably more stable, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
for sure.
That was basically exactly what I was going to say, Mike. I think we're sharing a brain sometimes with this stuff, but
no, I'll never be a ranger, Theric. So go ahead.
We don't want you. It's fine. So my question, Kevin, is sort of talking from the perspective of being in development. Pantheon's in pre-alpha development right now, and they have an unparalleled connection in terms of connection with the player base from the developers. It's the most connected to a development team that I've ever been personally involved with. And we have the ability to reach out, and this doesn't just go for Pantheon, this goes for any game in development, the ability to reach out on social media or through other means to the members of the design team. And, with your background as a designer, with this impact on your ability as maintaining, artistic vision. In your videos, we touched this earlier. We said, you said democratic design is a recipe for disaster. You said there has to be the translation between what players are asking for and the design of the game, because if left to their own devices, players will ask for things that are not in their best interest. Right. And I think you're right about that. So my question is, how do you prevent that from happening, especially in like crowdfunded games, which Pantheon is? It's got a very close connection to their community. How do you prevent the artistic vision from getting eroded?
Right. So from the player standpoint, it comes down to trust. Do you trust the designers to execute with their talents and their professionalism and their vision a game that you're going to enjoy, right?
Right.
If you do, leave them alone, right? Let them go. And that doesn't
if only
mean
it was that simple. If only.
That doesn't mean don't give them feedback, but don't expect anything in return is kind of, and then from the developer standpoint, they have to, I describe this as like having just the right amount of ego, right? You have to have enough that you can hold off every person in the community who wants to change your game into something that they want rather than something you're trying to make, right?
Yeah.
You have to be able to hold back. You have to be able to tell a sizable group of people no sometimes. But not so much ego that you're unwilling to budge when things don't go how you expected them to go, right? Because some people will go down with a ship when they could have made a few tweaks because, something didn't work out. It looked great on paper, but after playing it, it needs iteration, right? It's a really tough one.
Yeah.
And you're right in the sense that we have access to devs a lot more readily than we ever did back in the day. And so that the importance of what I'm talking about is even higher now than it was back then, because I was nicely sheltered, like no one knew who I was or doing what I was doing. And so I could just do what I wanted and I could laugh at whatever you guys were saying on the forums.
Exactly.
Badly and keep on with my wild ideas. Right. But, and Kickstarter is particularly, fraught with danger because it is crowdfunded and people, they don't just see it as a game they're buying in advance. They see it as an investment and they want to be a shareholder in terms of the ideas and what they're getting. When in doubt, when in reality, they haven't paid more and in some cases less than what they would have had they just bought the game after it came out.
So true. So true.
There's a weird perception there that I'm a shareholder and therefore, do what I say. But if you ask yourself, do you want them to do what the guy next to you is saying? Right. If you don't, then
they don't do what you do either. Yeah.
They probably shouldn't be listening to you either. So.
Yeah, I like what you said about saying no. It sort of like makes me think of as a parent, you have to sort of be the parent sometimes, and your kids don't want to hear you say no, but at the end of the day, it's for their best, it's in their best interest, right? So you think of it like that.
You're thinking of the bigger picture, right? That's a real common analogy I use is, that the dad's playing a game with his son and everyone in the crowd is yelling, "Oh, let him win one." It's just like, nope, I'm trying to get him ready for the real world. He gets up and he gets old and he's a big baby because everything was handed to him.
Right.
He's be unprepared because no one's going to love him like I do. Right. So
exactly.
You have a bigger responsibility. Right. And so game designers in a lot in the same ways. They have a responsibility to create an experience that sometimes you're going to not like, but sometimes you're going to absolutely adore. So,
right.
And the first thing players will do is get rid of all the things they don't like. That's the easy, to them, that's the low hanging fruit. But that actually just makes the game a lot worse in a lot of cases.
Right. Yeah.
So last question in this topic, being a fan of UO and EQ, the basic MMO RPG players changed. I mean, it's grown. There's a lot more people playing them today than when those games came out. We've talked a lot about just societal changes in throughout this. Do you think it's possible to bring back those feelings that people are holding on to from UO or EQ? Or do you think you have to sort of approach it differently because those days are behind us?
I think in some respects you can't do the things we did. Like UO, I don't think can be recreated without a bunch of men in black coming to each of our houses and mind wiping us. But on the other side, I don't think what players actually want and enjoy in terms of like human nature and psychology have changed that much. We haven't had enough time to really evolve in that sense. Like our access to information is larger, more readily available. Our tools are more powerful. Our communication is much more accessible. But in terms of like the feels and the good gaming experiences, I don't think we've changed that much. So I think, again, it comes down to game designers being kind of firm with their vision and saying, yeah, we know people can data mine everything and put spoilers up all over the internet, but we also know that there's people that aren't going to look at that because they want a good exploration type experience. And so we're going to design for that person, right? We're going to design a game that's full of wonder and exploration and rewards for exploring and figuring things out. And, the spoiler people will do what they do, and they'll race to the end, and they'll blow through the game, and they'll be like, this game sucks. There's no content, right? Or whatever it is. Yeah. And they'll be gone. It'll be a dead game to them in a month, but everyone who remains will still be chipping away at this wondrous exploratory, experience that is full of process and that's okay. Like, figure out who you're designing for.
Yeah.
And be okay with some people shortcutting that.
What's interesting that you brought, as you were saying that, like, because we hear that a lot, actually. There's a system in Pantheon, it's called the Keeper system. Mm-hmm. It's super intuitive. It's going to have multi-flags with what you've killed, who you've talked to, how you've interacted. Right. And it's going to, you don't have to be a keeper. You have to actually choose to be, and you hear voices and you get clues, and it's very lore and explorative for that type of player. And it's funny because you brought that up, and there's the negative crowd, right? Says, well, people just look it up and watch videos. It doesn't even matter. Right. But it's funny because as you were talking about that, I'm thinking to myself, well, think of the Marvel Universe movies, right? Right. How many people out of the millions that went and saw those avoided spoilers because they wanted to experience it? Yet there's this gaming crowd that thinks, oh, everybody's just going to spoil it, so why do it? Well, then you wouldn't make these movies,
And some of that is, again, because of the only ththings that matter now are rate and parses and how fast you're speed running everything. And that's a perception that's all that matters. But the reality is there's tons of gamers below that level that are just having a good time, cruising up to their computer, firing it up, not reading anything on a second monitor they don't own, they're just playing the game, like they jump on the weekends after a long day's work, long week of work. And, that's what they do. Right. And designers need to think about that audience a little bit more and not stress so much about the speedrunners.
I think you pretty much provided the perfect answer there to the next question that I had, actually, because we're going to talk about open world instancing a little bit. One of the phrases in the Pantheon community that was coined by Brad McQuaid, he said he wanted to make worlds, not games. And again, the community sort of attached themselves to that expression. And it's a good one because it sort of inspires, it sort of makes you think of things a little differently. Like what you were just saying. When you design an MMO with that in mind, from that perspective, not looking at it as a competitive race to the finish, more of a holistic experience.
Right.
I don't know. I don't know what my question is here because, like I said, you just sort of answered it already. But is that sort of encapsulate that world's not games? Does that sort of encapsulate for you what you're talking about there?
And one of the things I talk about a ton are the 3 pillars of MMO design. One pillar is the game has to be a good game. Another pillar is it has to be a good social environment. And the third pillar is it has to have a large sense of world, a big sense of world. And, Brad's touching on that there with that quote. It's open-ended enough where you're not quite sure what he means, but here's what I'll read into it, and one that vibes with my design philosophy. That one of the things that makes the MMO genre special and unique from other games is it's not just a game that you play. It's a world that you actually live in. And one of the key elements of that is that this world is spinning whether you're there or not, right? And you miss it when you're not there, and you worry that you're missing out on the things that are going on in that world when you're not there, right? So that's why you're excited and anxious to get back to it, because people are running around and having a good time without you, right? And it's just always flicking at your ear, Whereas most other games, they wait for you to connect, right? They wait for you to show up, and then they start, feeding you content, right?
Right.
But it's not doing anything until you fire it up. And so that's one of the key elements of MMOs, and what makes it so special and captivating for so many of us. And so sometimes there are decisions that come along where it's like, I could make the game better here by doing this, but it's going to cause severe damage to the sense of world and the social interaction. And to me, that's not worth it, right? And so you have to always measure every change against those three pillars. And sometimes you're going to improve two and worsen the third, and you'd be like, okay, that's worth it. And sometimes you're not. Sometimes it's going to be a net result loss overall, even though it seems like a clear win. And usually this is in the game category, right? Yeah, I can make this game a lot better if I make a button that all I have to do is push and I can get into a dungeon group. But now people don't run around the world to find where the dungeon is. They don't respect the travel time to get there. They're just teleported instantly. The social experience is way worse because you didn't have to talk to anyone before you showed up. Everyone just treats each other like shit if they talk to each other at all, right? Exactly. And then, so, it's a better game, but it's done severe damage to the sense of world and the social environment. So not worth it, right?
Agreed.
And so it's exciting to hear quotes like that, because that tells me he has a mind towards that very thing, which is not trading, a sense of world and the social environment for what would be considered improvements in the game element, because you're not trying to compete with all the other kinds of genres out there that all they do is focus on game. You're not trying to compete with those. This is a special genre, and it needs to be handled in a special way. And that's why we love it and sometimes hate it. Yeah. That's the end result is this is more than just a game. It's a world, and it ends up being our community for a lot of people.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
That's awesome. So why we kind of made this the open world instancing questioning topic is because one of the big things that Pantheon wants to bring back is that open world dungeons where you're in there with a group and there's another group beside you, right? And you're camping. Right. Mobs are respawning. Right. You're racing to boss fights. You are in a raid. You see another raid group. That you're constantly feeling people around you, and it kind of ties into that the world, right? Because when you're instancing, then it's like you're in your own little box, right? You almost go into a single player experience for that time. Right. And when it's too easy to get from instance to instance, like you said, you've lost the world in the middle.
Right. So that one's difficult, but go ahead.
Yeah. So they're doing this open world thing. And I think for the most part, personally, for me, I'm really good with it. I enjoy the camping, the slower pace, the time to talk in between pulls, the respawning, the dungeon pushing you to move, because if you don't, it's going to come up behind you. I like that aspect.
Right.
But the thing that anybody could say anything negative they want about WoW to me, being a guild leader, having these guild moments, I think that WoW raiding is the pinnacle of anything I've ever done in an MMO. And I love multiple MMO, but WoW raiding to me is just, it's so new and it's innovative, and they just constantly outdo themselves with these just intricate fights that involve environment and instances and just all this crazy stuff. One of my biggest fears about Pantheon is I have no problem with the dungeon play. I have no problem with the raid itself. I have no problem with open world and competing for camps or camping. I am afraid that in an open world raid boss fight that you can't possibly program without an instance environment a fight that's intuitive as you would see in WoW. Do you agree with that or disagree with that?
It's tough. There's a lot of unique challenges for sure. And again, depends on how they approach it. If it's sort of Zerg encouraging, like they don't have mechanics, where like Kazakh, shoots a bunch of shadow bolts, and if he kills somebody, he heals, and so you only want to bring players that are ready to go. You don't want to bring a bunch of guys that are just going to feed Kazakh, right? If they don't do any of those mechanics, then they're inviting the Zerg, which is kind of silly at the end of the day.
Yeah.
If they do mechanics like that, then other people can sabotage really easily. And in a PvE only environment where you can't actually, prevent people through PvP measures from running into the place, then you're looking at people essentially, sabotaging runs, right? And so there's a lot of unique challenges on no matter what you decide to do with raid design. And this overall, it's a really tough, and we went a different way than EQ, than the non-instance dungeons, because in relation to what I was talking about earlier, game world and social, I think non-instance dungeons are way more social, right? That's one area that is dramatically increased because you have to talk to people, you have to manage the social environment of who's at what camps and who's up next on this camp, and all that stuff. You have to work all that stuff out, which can be a really engaging and compelling social environment. From a world standpoint, I think it's a mix. The world is a really, at the end of the day, a really powerful thing. That there aren't like a bunch of alternate parts of this world. We all go in and come out with dragon heads, and we're kind of looking at each other like, oh, that's weird. Like who actually killed Anixia or whatever. But it's also weird that when in prime time, every camp in a dungeon is suppressed. Like this is supposed to be hostile territory. And everyone's just kind of walking around freely because there's just so many people here, camping all the spawns essentially, that we've like taken over this area of the world. Feels a little strange. And so it's kind of a mix there. It's kind of a wash. And then from a game standpoint, obviously it feels really icky to have to wait in line for things. And also just like you can't tell a story, like through a dungeon run or a raid run. It's really difficult to get that beginning, middle, and end sort of experience when you're skipping the first 2/3 because the camp near the end is the only one that's uncamped, right? So you zip down to like the 8th encounter of the 10 in the dungeon. You're like, and you just do that one for a few hours over and over, and then you move to the 4th, or then everyone calls it a night, and you just leave. And it's hard to tell a story in that environment. So, there are a lot of pros and cons to both. But I'm happy that it's not a one-sided discussion. It's not one is right and one is wrong. And I'm definitely interested to see how they manage some of the cons in terms of non-instance world.
Right.
Because I think some people are going to be irritated. And it's been a long time since a new game came out with all non-instance content. So I think Ashen Creation is going to try a pretty heavy percentage of non-instance as well. And so that'll be interesting for them as well. But it's not one or the other. And so I'll be interested to see how they handle or manage. And some of that can just come down to server sizes, like if they cap server sizes to a reasonable level. So at the beginning of the game, the most, terrifying content isn't heavily camped, and it only kind of gets more and more camped as the server gets older and older. And that might be good. Or they can just let too many people in from the get-go. And then they have everything is camped all the time as the sort of bubble moves through the levels, which could feel kind of, bad at times. So we'll see. But there's a lot of interesting design work to be done in a non-instance world type of game.
The community as a whole is very afraid of that term instance. And I'm on the side where it's like,
totally understand. Yeah.
yeah, because I think a lot of MMO fans are very afraid of what I like to call the slippery slope.
Right.
Like an idea on itself is okay, right?
Yeah.
But what if it becomes this?
Right.
And it's always this fear, like, you can name almost anything, cash shop. Okay, well, if they only do this in the cash shop, that's okay, but it's going to become this. If they only instance this, then it's going to be everything. I feel like there's so much information out there that you can do the best of both worlds. Like, I love the open dungeons. I love open raids. But if there's key pinnacle fights, why not just instance that boss room that's in the bottom of a raid that you have to fight your way to so that a guild doesn't need to bat phone? I think the days of bat phoning and waiting for a spawn to come up and maybe getting a shot are dead. I don't think you can go back to that.
Yeah. It's a tough one. Some people love that, and some people consider that part of the game of, being first there and whatnot. Yeah. That race, which can be exhilarating. But yeah. And obviously the community comes a lot from EQ, which had a very different style of doing a lot of things. Yeah. And there's always going to be people that just want the exact same thing again, but the modern version of it, don't touch anything. Obviously with Classic, there was the whole no changes community, which I get on paper, but when it's taken as black and white, it's unrealistic, right?
Yeah. If it was that easy to just clone EQ and have it again, then people would just be playing EQ. Like, it has to evolve.
Yeah. So nothing's that simple, and they should have game designers on it, and they do. And unlike Classic, and hopefully they'll work out, these things. But yeah, it's going to come down to trust again of, you trust these guys to deliver on your dream. Yeah.
Here's the mail, it never fails. It makes me want to wag my tail. When it gets here, I just yell, mail! We're getting sued.
Okay, great. So let's go into the mailbox. So these are questions that we asked in our Discord for people to come up with, to ask you during the show. Right. So we've got a few of them, and we can just give some quicker answers. You don't need to go go into too depth on these, but I'll go with the first one.
45-minute lengths. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so do we. That's the problem.
Yeah.
At the end of the show, we're gonna have a 6-hour show, but I'm just joking around. So the first one is from Zelik, and Zelik asked, if you could offer one piece of advice, something you know now that you wish you knew when you first started with WoW doing class design, what would you say to yourself back then?
Oh gosh. Why do you have to be so damn handsome? Let's see. Oh, it's funny because I get this time machine question a lot. And I always think that I always feel like there's more risk that it will be worse than it would be better. If I make changes.
The butterfly effect.
Yeah. Like, cause things worked out so well. I mean, that
how can you go back and change it, right, when it worked out?
Yeah, it's like, I'm just being greedy, right? Like, there's probably a few things. Like, I definitely learned some interesting things. That hybrids don't actually work in reality. People talk about hybrid a lot. I think for me, I have a different sort of interpretation. And I would say the only class that was designed to be an actual hybrid was the Druid in WoW. And what I mean by that is someone that could perform multiple roles in the same fight, as opposed to you can be multiple roles, but never more than one at one time. So it's fine that your paladin, is a prop paladin and he can heal. He's not going to be a very good healer. He's just going to be a tank. And so his healing ability is not even close to the, comparable with actual healers, even the holy paladin next to him. So, but with the Druid, we tried to make him legitimately a hybrid, and, 90 to 95% as good as the specialists, while allowing you to be multiples at the same time doesn't cut it. It's hard for you to be 10% behind the mark and have anyone be excited to have you in the group. So we pretty quickly learned that we had to get them up to 100% and make them pick a role like everyone else. So that's probably one of the things I would warn myself about. And people call it the hybrid tax or whatever, but
I really thought you were going to say you would have not made every piece of loot hunter loot, because
right. No, that's one of my favorite things. Should have rolled 8 on it. That video would have never been made if.
The next one comes from Sagrada. They said if there was one class you worked on that you could recreate from the ground up, what would it be and what would you have changed?
Oh, so yeah, no way would I rebuild from the ground up. There were a number of classes or specs within the classes that didn't live up to the class fantasy that I put forward. And I talk about class fantasy in that sort of identity sense, where if you were to pick like a character from a movie that you're trying to create with a class spec combination, and you're trying to do that and the game just doesn't let you live that dream. There were a couple, the survival spec on the hunter and the retribution spec on the paladin were two that come to mind. Just didn't quite live up to what the package I was trying to deliver. So would have wished I had more time to polish those up.
Yeah.
Every rep pally that just stuck through, it's like just had a tear come out of their eye.
That's right. And they know, my community knows. I definitely put them in the top 3 of like failure to live up to the class fantasy. And they still had their moments, right? But definitely didn't get all the way there.
It's funny actually, because the next question is related, but actually flips it over and asks. So this is from JJ. He says, when you're designing a class, the kit often reflects the fantasy of the class. Sometimes abilities stay within the fantasy, but then other times they go beyond. So he gives an example of mage that can cast Fireball, Frostbolt, but then they're given like altering time abilities or time travel. So he asks, what are some of your favorite beyond expectation abilities from the class fantasy for you?
Oh, that's interesting. Actually, time was always part of his kit. So it's interesting that he pulled that out. I don't know if you guys ever saw that old animation, the Wizard of Speed and Time. But anyway, time was a big part of his kit and the Arcane kit, because they had haste and slow from the Warcraft games. And those had to do with time. And so we folded that in. Let's see. As far as the rest, God, that's a tough one. That's a really tough one. I don't have any offhand that popped to mind. Most things were pretty firmly within the kit.
Yeah. It's funny there. You mentioned time, being a mage, ability to alter time. And again, my knowledge of World of Warcraft lore comes completely from Hearthstone. I always think about these decks, right? And there was a mage deck that time stop made, where it could basically stop the time and create this sort of endless turn that never ended. And it was one of my favorite decks when it was in the meta and when it was viable, sort of thing. Nice. I loved that deck because it was so much fun to just play with the turn time so much. And
there was definitely some things, to try to answer that question. There were things that we put in that seemed appropriate, but then pulled out because they were stepping on the toes of other classes. It was usually the mage. We took out invisibility at first because it was too roguelike. And also there was a spell called Khadgar's Unlocking, which would let him unlock things. And so that would also step on the toes of the rogue. And so things you could definitely see within their kit, especially like we use D&D a lot as a reference point, and D&D mages can basically do anything. And so their kit was just unlimited. But yeah, in terms of the game and trying to make sure every class had its own identity and its own tricks, and we had to pull back quite a bit. And even then, the mage was extremely versatile. So
how did it feel to give the Alliance a heroism?
Oh, I hated that. Anything, because again, I'm huge on identity. So I loved Horde versus Alliance. I love Shaman being Horde only, Paladin Alliance only. So I argued against the crossover. I argued against, again, homogenizing the Shaman and Paladin to, offer the same things as the other side, just to make sure, just to quell the fires of people complaining about which side was raiding faster.
Yeah.
Which mathematically wasn't supported. Like Blessing of Kings was way more impactful by like a country mile than Bloodlust.
But it wasn't like momentarily able to be seen, right? So it was more of a sprint
it was
through.
the psychology of it, yeah. And there were fights where you had tremendous buffs, and so if you hit Bloodlust at that time, there were some compounding effects, right? But that wasn't every raid. Like Blessing of Kings was just the slow, steady, completely busted buff, right? That affected 40 people, and right. So
that's really funny for you to, I never thought about those two spells being the counter to each other. I know it now; it's very obvious to me now that you've said it. But like, wow, yeah, that's interesting.
So, yeah, but I never enjoyed, fixing problems that way. I would much rather us take the unique mechanics that each side had and tweak them a little bit rather than just let everyone have everything to stop the complaining.
Yeah. All right, last question in the mailbox here. You are almost home free. You almost get to go back to your life here.
Nice.
So, Walking Waste, he had two questions. The first one was, what was your favorite class to design or type? So healers, tanks, crowd control, like range DPS, melee. So we'll start with that. Do you have a favorite?
So the way I always answer this question is, you're basically trying to turn me into Sophie from Sophie's Choice. It's very rude to make me pick one of my children that I love most.
You must have done it.
So I never answer that question because they each had their own, they're beautiful and flawed in their own unique ways. And
I think that's a pretty good answer.
I loved them all. And yeah, I loved working on all of them. Yeah, again, I'm a huge class design fiend. I love PvP, but I had to shelve my desire to just be the PvP guy, so that I could work on classes because that's my one true love.
Nice. And the last one here, which I know Theric's excited to hear about, he's our lore guy. When you're designing classes, especially WoW has an advantage, sort of like Final Fantasy has an advantage that there's all this lore before the game. And I think that's really helped. If you look at the top three, arguably the top three MMOs right now from a population standpoint, it's probably ESO, Final Fantasy, and WoW. And all of those have just years and years and years of lore before the game was even made.
Right.
So when you were making classes, how much did lore and working with the writers influence how classes were designed?
A huge amount, because one of the first premises of the game was to allow people that had played the RTS games to zoom way into the helmet of one of those units on the ground and live in that world, right? And so finally I could make the orc grunt, or the dwarven rifleman, or the night elf druid, or whatever it was. So that was one of the fantasies we were trying to execute on, was finally I get to zoom way in and be one of those guys. And so, yeah, we borrowed heavily, and we tried to make sure as many of those iconic units and everything else could be created within World of Warcraft. And then from a design standpoint, the best designs are a mix of what we call top down and bottom up design. So bottom up is like the foundation, sort of mechanical. Where does this fit? What tools does this have? What does it offer the game? What are its play patterns like? Things like that. And then the top down is like the pure kind of thematic, the lore side of what does it feel like? What kind of visuals and sound effects and, feel and the story and all that stuff. And then when those two things meet in the middle, you end up with a character class that's like really well balanced in terms of, we know it needs powerful, direct damage spells. Well, he's got Fireball for a mage, or he's got Frostbolt. So there's two. And then you build from there. We also need one that slows people. Well, attach that to the Frostbolt, right? And so when those things meet and they mesh, that's when you get the kind of the best designs. The people that are thinking like sort of from that romantic standpoint of, oh, what kind of amazing experience is this going to play into, versus the guy who's just very mechanical and he's thinking, well, we need this and that and the other thing to fit into my grand scheme of things. And unfortunately, I was on both sides of that. But that's how I approach things. Was trying to meet in the middle with different ideas, and I think that's where the kind of the best ideas or the best designs peek through, is when you find yourself not forcing it too often. Like a lot of times one is overpowering the other, and then you end up forcing things, and things are kind of an odd fit at times.
Right.
And I didn't feel that way too often with WoW. So
nice. Yeah, no, it's interesting. This comes up in the Pantheon community when they talk about, or we talk about the race and class matrix, like which races can be which classes, and it's always this like, well, I think this would be an amazing combination, right? But it doesn't really fit with the lore. Right, so you have to, there's always that push and pull when it comes to.
Why can't elves be healer classes? And it's like, see what they did to their city? They don't know a thing about taking care of people.
I know the discussion definitely goes off in some tangents, and we get into all these different reasons. But I think you're probably right with regard to the meeting in the middle sort of being where it's at.
But yeah, in terms of race class, it's identity again. It's like things form an identity from what they can be, and also very importantly from what they can't be.
Exactly.
So, and I think that plays into a lot of really cool moments.
It really does. I one of the lead writer for Pantheon is Jan Gerhardt, and he talked in an interview recently about one of the races and why they can be clerics. And I won't go into the whole details, but basically he said they had such a interesting racial background that they created this contrast and this sort of counterpoint as being a cleric, because you wouldn't think of them necessarily being able to be clerics, but that was what made it interesting. So
you can definitely write your way out of a lot of boxes, a lot of corners. Blood Elf Paladin is sort of Metzen's, ode to that, right?
Right.
Which I think turned out okay. Like it could have gone a lot worse.
Always the standard.
And I was unhappy with the crossover to begin with. So I was ready to just say, this is awful, how dare you, right? But I think it actually turned out pretty well. I think it did a pretty good job with it.
Well, Kevin, we've taken up your entire evening here. So I think we should probably wrap this up. Man, I really want to express gratitude from both of us for agreeing to come on the show and just talking MMOs with us like this. Like,
my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Our listeners, this is what they get excited to hear. And this is hearing your insights. Definitely, they've heard Minus and I talk about these things ad nauseum, right? So they're done with hearing that. We were like, we got to bring somebody else on the show to keep it interesting. So thanks again. But before we sign off, I did want to give you a chance, like Minus talked about in the beginning, to sort of give a shout out to any projects you're working on, or any, anything else you've got going on. Where can people support your work, and what are you working on right now?
Right now, I'm primarily a full-time Twitch streamer. So what I do basically is stream 5 nights a week during the week, and I just play games and we talk about game design. And right now I'm playing a lot of Shadowlands because it's the hot new thing. I played a lot of Final Fantasy recently. And then lots of other, just from indie games to other RPGs to shooters. I love Tarkov, and and then we just hang out and chat. It's super chill. The community is small enough where we can interact quite a bit. So if you guys want to come by, anyone wants to come by and just say hello or ask questions, feel free. As a testament to how excited I am about Pantheon, most games that I'm not excited about, I'll follow their progress pretty closely just to like see what they're designing and how they're approaching it. But I haven't really looked into Pantheon at all because I just want to see it fresh when it comes out and have it be that wonderful, world that I can explore with completely, new buys. And so, I am excited about it. So it should be.
That's awesome.
I'm really rooting for it too, because Brad was a really smart guy. I was able to meet him once, had a great conversation. And I definitely think the space is pretty ripe for some old school philosophies in terms of MMO design. So I'm really excited to see how this game shapes up. But
that's fantastic.
Yeah, come by and talk on Twitch. It's just twitch.com or twitch.tv/Kevin Jordan. Nice. And then I've got my YouTube channel as well, which is just Kevin Jordan.
Yeah. And we'll leave links for all that in the description and in the podcast page. Minus, was there anything else you wanted to say before we sign off here?
No, just really enjoyed this. It went by really quick for me. I love talking theory. I could do it forever, and I made sure not to go off on my tangents. So, but no, thank you, man. It was my pleasure to have you, and I'm so thankful, and I appreciate you. I reached out to you, and you were really quick to respond, and really awesome. Just really fun to work with, and getting this all set up. So I thank you for that, pleasure. And like I said, the videos you're doing on YouTube and the replays of some of the things you've talked about with MMO stuff, like as soon as I discovered those videos, it was from a community member. I fell in love with them. There was a lot of things that I felt strong about and great perspectives on. So guys, go check those out. We talked about the itemization video before, like go watch that one. I love that video. So the graphs are so perfect. Forget about what that person said with the axes.
That's right. It's totally fine. See.
Yeah, but thank you very much. And
I'll tell you a little later about transmog. You wanted to have a
hey, you want to talk
have
transmog?
You back on for another show where we do we'll do a transmog show if you're willing to come back.
I made a transmog video that
you've seen my Shadowlands character, so
yeah. Man.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you again, Kevin. And thanks everyone for tuning in today. Just remember, you can catch the rewind during the premiere on YouTube, and you can hang out with me and chat, or you can download it from any one of our podcast platforms like iTunes or Spotify or all the rest. And like I said earlier, there's links in the descriptions for those and for Kevin's stuff. So make sure you check that out. And Minus, we'll see you guys again next week.
Until then. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Pantheon Plus Rewind. Be sure to follow Minus and all Pantheon Plus related content on Twitter, Twitch, and YouTube under the name Pantheon Plus. Also, be sure to follow Theric at Pantheon Theric on Twitter. Keep up to date on all Pantheon Rise of the Fallen information on www.pantheon.plus, the definitive source for all media of Pantheon. Until next time.